The sun pressed down on the desert plain like a blacksmith's hammer on iron, relentless and unforgiving. Every grain of sand seemed to shimmer with heat, and the air itself wavered in waves of shimmering gold. Hunters had spotted her from a distance, a lone figure stumbling across the barren land, her dress clinging to her with sweat. They whispered among themselves, thinking she would not survive the day. They had no doubt the desert would claim her before nightfall. She moved slowly, each step heavy, dragging one foot after the other, leaving faint imprints in the dry earth. Her skin was blistered by the sun, her hair matted with dust, but there was a stubbornness in her eyes, a flicker of life that refused to bow. She carried nothing but a small bundle pressed to her chest, something wrapped tightly in a piece of cloth. Whatever it was, it seemed to weigh as much as the desperation on her shoulders. From behind a ridge, an Apache watched. His dark eyes, calm and steady, took in every detail. He had been trailing the hunters for hours, knowing they moved with their own purpose, but not noticing him. He saw the woman struggle, her lips dry and cracked, her skin burning under the blazing sun. He saw the hunters' smug confidence, the way they muttered to one another, certain that death would reach her first. They did not see him, nor did they suspect that he had already decided the outcome of this day would not be theirs to claim. The woman stumbled, caught off balance by a sudden gust of hot wind that tore across the plain. She fell onto her knees, coughing against the dry air, and the bundle in her arms threatened to slip from her grasp. For a moment, it seemed as though she would simply collapse, swallowed by the vast emptiness around her, but something inside her refused surrender. She took a deep, shuddering breath and rose, her body trembling under the effort. The hunters laughed quietly, cruel and confident, thinking this would be the end. Their shadows stretched long and thin over the sand, approaching the woman with ease, their boots crunching against the dry terrain. They had not yet noticed the figure hidden among the rocks ahead, and if they had, they would have dismissed him as one more illusion in the heat. But the Apache's presence was not an illusion. He moved with silent precision, every step calculated, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. She stopped to rest under the meager shade of a gnarled cactus, pressing her face against its rough bark. Her chest rose and fell with exhaustion, and she glanced around the barren expanse, as if searching for a miracle that might appear in the heat haze. The hunters' laughter faded behind her, but their presence lingered like a shadow, and she knew they would not let her escape easily. The Apache adjusted his position, crouching lower so that the sun would not betray him. He remembered the stories his elders had told him, of women who had been left to die in the desert, abandoned by their kin or hunted by strangers. There was something in her that reminded him of those tales, a quiet strength that refused to vanish even in the face of certain death. She was not like the others. She had survived this long in a place that would break most men. The wind shifted again, carrying the hunters' voices faintly toward him. They were closing in, discussing their plans as if the woman's life were a game. Their arrogance made him bristle, but he remained still, waiting for the right moment to act. He did not move until he knew it was necessary. In his mind, he traced the woman's steps backward, imagining the path she had taken to reach this place, and he realized she had been fleeing for more than just survival. There was a story behind her struggle, something that demanded he intervene, though the reasons were not yet clear. The woman adjusted the bundle in her arms, holding it tighter, as if it were her only tether to life. Her legs ached with every step, her lungs burned with the effort, yet she pressed on, following a route that twisted and turned in the unforgiving terrain. She could hear the distant echo of hunters' boots on stone and sand, and she knew she could not rest for long. Her mind raced with fear and strategy, calculating every movement, every pause, every chance she might have to survive. The Apache observed quietly, noticing the subtle details that others would overlook. The way she balanced her weight, the slight hesitation in her step, the glimmer of determination in her eyes. He could see that she was not completely alone, that some part of her still held hope. And yet, he also saw the danger closing in from all directions. If he did nothing, she would be at the mercy of the hunters. The sun climbed higher, beating down without mercy. The desert offered no refuge, only open space, jagged rocks, and blistering sand. The woman's shadow grew smaller and smaller beneath her, her strength waning with every passing moment. Yet she did not collapse, she did not cry out. Something deeper than fear propelled her forward, something that refused to accept surrender. The hunters had now drawn closer, and their voices rang louder in the open air. They were confident, cruel, and unaware that they were being watched. The Apache's grip tightened on the bow slung across his back, and he considered his options. He could intervene now, but there was a risk. If he acted too soon, he might alert the hunters and put the woman in greater danger. Patience, he reminded himself, is a weapon as sharp as any arrow. The woman paused at the edge of a small ravine, her body trembling under the heat and fatigue. She set the bundle down, her hands shaking violently, and pressed her forehead to the earth. The sun scorched her back, but she did not move. Somewhere deep inside, she drew strength from the small bundle, from the thought that she could not falter. She did not yet know that help was close, that eyes unseen had been tracing her struggle from the shadows. Suddenly, the wind carried a sound, faint but distinct. The hunters were dividing their forces, spreading out as they advanced. The woman noticed it too, a subtle shift in the air, a change in the rhythm of the desert. Her eyes flicked to the distant rocks, squinting against the sun, sensing something she could not fully understand. It was instinct, a survival instinct honed by hours of running, of hiding, of holding on when all else seemed lost. The Apache's gaze followed hers, noting the recognition, the moment she became aware of him without knowing it. He could see the question in her eyes, the silent plea for understanding, for help, for intervention. He remained still, knowing that the wrong move now could spell disaster, but also aware that she would not survive much longer under the relentless sun. The tension built, thick and heavy in the air, as if the desert itself held its breath. The hunters paused at the top of the ridge, scanning the terrain, confident that the woman would not reach safety. One of them raised a hand, signaling to the others, and they began moving again, deliberately, with the ease of those who think victory is certain. But the Apache's presence changed the balance. Unseen, he watched, calculating, waiting for the exact moment when his intervention would matter most. The woman rose slowly, brushing sand from her dress, and picked up the bundle once more. Her legs wobbled, her throat was dry, and sweat streamed down her face, but she refused to give in. She took a careful step, then another, moving toward a narrow path that led between two jagged rocks. If she could reach that path, she might gain a few moments of cover, a chance to catch her breath, a sliver of hope in an otherwise merciless land. The Apache shifted slightly, remaining out of sight, his heart steady but his mind alert. He knew that the next minutes would determine whether she lived or died, and he would not allow the hunters to claim her. He considered the distance, the angle, the timing of his movements. Every detail mattered. One wrong decision, and it could all be lost. The hunters, however, did not notice the signs. They were confident, cruel, and utterly convinced of her demise. They laughed again, low and mocking, unaware that the balance of fate was not in their favor. They did not see the silent figure watching from the rocks, waiting for the moment when he would step from the shadows. The woman reached the narrow path, her breath ragged, her body trembling, and paused. She glanced behind her, sensing danger but uncertain of its source. The sun burned relentlessly overhead, and the desert stretched endlessly in all directions. She did not know that eyes were upon her, that a protector had been following her every step. She did not yet know that her fate could change in an instant, that the hunters' confidence was about to be challenged in a way they had never expected. Time seemed to slow, the desert holding its breath as the woman prepared to move forward. The hunters were drawing closer, their shadows falling over the sand like dark fingers reaching for her. The Apache adjusted his grip on his weapon, readying himself for what was to come. He had witnessed her struggle, her courage, and her determination, and he knew he could not stand idly by. And then, just as the woman stepped forward, the wind shifted again, carrying a faint sound that caused her to freeze. Something had changed, though she could not yet understand it. She sensed movement, a presence in the rocks above her, and for the first time, a flicker of hope mingled with her fear. The hunters were unaware. They had not yet realized that their certainty was fragile, and that the desert, so merciless moments before, might not claim her after all. The Apache's eyes narrowed, his focus absolute. He watched the hunters approach, calculating the exact moment when he could intervene without revealing his position too soon. He had witnessed enough to know that the woman's life hung in a delicate balance, and he would not allow it to tip into death. And then it happened, a sudden movement, swift and precise, the kind that only comes from years of knowing the land, of reading the shadows and the wind. The woman froze, the bundle clutched tightly to her chest as the desert seemed to tremble around her. The hunters continued their advance, oblivious, and the tension reached its peak, thick and unyielding. The Apache was ready. The moment had come, though what would happen next remained uncertain. The woman did not yet know she had an ally, a silent witness to her struggle, someone who might alter her fate forever. And the hunters, confident and cruel, were about to discover that not all is as it seems under the relentless heat of the desert sun. The woman held the bundle close, feeling its weight like an anchor against her chest, but also as a reminder of something she could not abandon. Her mind raced with fragments of memory, flashes of the life she had once known before the harsh reality of the desert had stolen everything familiar. She remembered a small cabin, a quiet home that smelled of bread and smoke, a place that had seemed safe once. But that world had been taken from her long ago, leaving only the harsh sun, the jagged rocks, and the endless sand stretching in every direction. As she paused at the narrow path, her eyes scanning for cover, she thought of the hunters. They were not merely strangers, they were determined, experienced, and dangerous. She could feel their focus even from a distance, a pressure in the air that pressed against her chest. She did not know why they pursued her or what they expected to find in this empty stretch of land, but she knew instinctively that escape would require more than speed or courage. It would require cunning, patience, and perhaps something beyond what she alone could muster. The Apache observed her carefully, noting the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she placed one foot in front of the other. He had watched many faces in the desert, seen the pride and stubbornness of those who refused to yield to hardship, but there was something unique in her resolve. She was not merely trying to survive. She was carrying purpose, a reason to keep moving despite the pain. That knowledge changed the way he saw her, not just as someone to save, but as someone whose fate mattered in ways the hunters could never understand. He remembered the stories told around the fire in his youth, of women who had been left behind, abandoned by their families, or preyed upon by those who thought cruelty was strength. These stories had shaped him, teaching him that survival often depended not only on skill, but on quiet observation, on understanding the heart of another being. And now, as he watched the woman falter but persist, he felt a pull to intervene, though he knew the timing had to be perfect. One wrong move could alert the hunters, and then the fragile balance between life and death would collapse. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, a palette of brown and gold, dotted with spiny bush and jagged rocks that seemed almost to watch in silence. Every step the woman took was a struggle, but she pressed on, driven by an instinct she barely understood herself. The bundle, wrapped tightly in cloth, seemed to thrum with quiet significance. She had no words for it, no explanation to herself, only a sense that whatever lay inside was as essential to her survival as the water she no longer had. Behind the ridge, the hunters advanced, voices low and confident, their boots kicking up tiny clouds of dust with each step. One of them stopped occasionally to scan the horizon, a rifle resting heavy against his shoulder. They believed themselves masters of the land, knowing how to track and trap, certain that no one could outwit them in the open expanse. They did not see the subtle shifts in the sand, the faint signs of someone watching, waiting. They did not see the eyes in the rocks, dark and unblinking, calculating and patient. The woman ducked beneath a rock overhang, pressing herself against the shadowed stone. Her chest rose and fell with ragged breaths, her body slick with sweat, her skin blistered by the sun. She glanced toward the hunters, uncertain whether to continue or to wait, knowing that any hesitation could cost her dearly. The Apache observed her every move, noting the small hesitation, the way her fingers tightened around the bundle. He could feel her fear, but also the determination that refused to be extinguished. He had seen that look before, in warriors and in survivors alike, and he knew it meant she would not give up easily. The wind shifted again, carrying the distant sound of the hunters' voices and the faint scrape of boots on stone. The woman's eyes flicked toward the ridge instinctively, sensing danger but unsure of its exact nature. Something deep inside urged her forward, toward a narrow passage between two rock formations that might offer more cover. She moved cautiously, each step deliberate, feeling the heat of the sun and the weight of the bundle as one. Behind her the hunters drew closer, unaware that their prey had a secret observer. The Apache considered his next move carefully. He could intervene now, but the risk was high. The hunters were skilled, and a misstep could turn the woman's fragile advantage into catastrophe. He would wait, remain unseen, and watch. He traced her path with his eyes, noting every detail, the slightest stumble, the way her fingers brushed against the rocks for balance. Each movement told him more about her, more about the strength she carried beneath exhaustion and fear. Memories of her past flickered through the woman's mind. She remembered her family, cold and distant, who had turned her away when she could not give them what they desired. She remembered their rejection as a young woman, the sense of worthlessness and abandonment that had marked her early life. Those memories had taught her endurance, had forced her to carry burdens alone. And now, here in the desert, those lessons mattered more than ever. She clutched the bundle as if holding it close could somehow shield her from the cruelty of the hunters, from the harshness of the land, from the unrelenting sun overhead. The hunters advanced with careful coordination, spreading out slightly to cover more ground. One of them raised his arm, signaling to the others, and they continued with deliberate steps, certain that the woman would soon falter. They did not notice the subtle signs of intervention that hovered nearby, the shadow in the rocks, the slight movement of a figure blending perfectly with the stone. The Apache's presence was almost imperceptible, yet it carried weight, ready to shift the balance of the unfolding moment. The woman found herself at the edge of a shallow canyon, the rocks rising steeply on either side. She pressed the bundle closer, feeling its warmth through the cloth. She could see the hunter's shadows stretching over the sand below, creeping closer with every heartbeat. Her body screamed for rest, her lungs burned, yet she pressed forward, driven by a combination of fear and determination. Somewhere deep inside, she understood that the desert might not yet claim her, that the world had not given up on her entirely. The Apache adjusted his stance, silently moving along a narrow ledge that gave him a better view. He could see her clearly now, her figure small and fragile against the vast canyon walls, yet carrying a presence that defied her apparent weakness. He traced her movements carefully, noting every hesitation, every step forward, and preparing for the moment when he could act. He understood the hunter's psychology, their overconfidence, their reliance on visibility and intimidation, and he knew he could use that against them. The woman reached a narrow passage, a sliver of shade between jagged rocks that offered a momentary refuge. She paused, her breath heavy, and glanced behind her once more. Something in the air made her hesitate, a sense that she was being observed, though she could not see who or what. Her instincts sharpened, memories of past dangers guiding her, teaching her to recognize threats even before they became visible. She pressed on slowly, cautiously, the bundle clutched tightly, and felt the desert around her pulse with unseen tension. The hunters stopped briefly, adjusting their positions, scanning the canyon with rifles at the ready. They whispered among themselves, confident that the woman would soon appear within their line of sight. Their arrogance blinded them to the silent presence above, to the careful watch of eyes that had seen the unfolding danger long before they had. They did not realize that the balance of life and death was no longer solely in their hands. The Apache moved silently, calculating his next step. Every rock, every shadow, every shift in the wind mattered. He could see her hesitation, could feel her fatigue, and he knew that if he waited too long, the desert might take its toll. Yet, if he acted too soon, the hunters could notice him, and the fragile advantage she had would vanish. He traced her path, memorizing the layout of the canyon, the possible routes of escape, and the positions of the hunters below. Patience, he reminded himself, was the deadliest weapon he could wield. The woman pressed forward, feeling the heat radiating off the rocks, the rough texture of the canyon walls scraping against her arms. She could hear the distant echoes of the hunters' movements, a sound that reminded her she was not alone in this struggle. Her mind raced with possibilities, planning her steps, considering the small ledges and hidden crevices that might offer cover. Every instinct, every lesson she had learned from a life of hardship, guided her forward, yet the danger remained constant, an invisible weight pressing upon her. The sun climbed higher, relentless as ever, and the shadows in the canyon shifted with the movement of the day. The woman moved with deliberate care, her body aching with exhaustion, her mind focused entirely on survival. She could not rest, could not allow herself the luxury of hesitation, because the hunters were patient, and they would wait for her to falter. She pressed forward, one careful step at a time, the bundle still clutched to her chest, and felt the subtle presence of another watching, though she did not yet know who. The Apache adjusted his position again, crouching lower to remain unseen. He had witnessed enough to know the hunters' patterns, to anticipate their movements, to understand the vulnerabilities in their approach. He traced the woman's path, considering the moment when he could act without revealing himself too soon. He felt a connection to her struggle, not merely as an observer, but as someone who recognized the raw determination in her eyes, the kind of resolve that could survive even the harshest desert trials. The woman paused at the narrowest point in the canyon, pressed against the stone, and allowed herself a single, ragged breath. Her eyes scanned the rocks ahead, searching for a way through, for any sign of safety. She did not know the Apache was above, silent and patient, but she felt, in some unexplainable way, that the desert was no longer entirely against her. Something unseen watched, waiting, a presence that carried both danger and promise. The hunters had reached the canyon floor, their shadows stretching long and thin in the heat. They whispered, unaware of the figure above them, unaware that the desert itself was holding its breath. They were confident, cruel, and unrelenting, but the balance of power had shifted in ways they could not perceive. The tension in the air was nearly unbearable, as if the canyon walls themselves were leaning in to witness what was about to unfold. The woman took another careful step forward, the bundle still clutched tightly. Her legs shook, her lungs burned, but she pressed on, guided by instinct, by memory, and by the faint, unexplainable sense that she was not alone. Somewhere above, hidden among the rocks, the Apache waited, patient and focused, ready to act at the precise moment when her life might hang in the balance. And then, in the quiet tension of the canyon, the world seemed to pause, as if the desert itself acknowledged the precarious moment. The woman, the hunters, and the silent observer above were locked in a fragile balance, each unaware of how close fate had drawn them together, each holding a piece of the outcome that had yet to be revealed. The canyon pressed in around the woman like the walls of a cage, shadows stretching long and thin under the blazing sun. She moved slowly, deliberately, aware that one misstep could betray her presence to the hunters below. Each footfall kicked up a small puff of sand that clung to her damp dress and burned her blistered feet. The bundle in her arms felt heavier with every step, yet she could not put it down. She had come too far to let exhaustion dictate her fate now. Behind her, the hunters paused at the canyon's mouth, spreading out as they did so. Their eyes scanned the rocks above and to either side, rifles at the ready. One of them muttered a warning about losing sight of her, and the others chuckled, confident that she could not survive the day. Their arrogance was thick in the hot air, a suffocating presence that pressed down on the woman even from a distance. They did not notice the small marks in the sand, the faint traces that hinted at her path, and they certainly did not notice the silent figure above, hidden among the rocks, observing every movement. The Apache shifted slightly, crouching lower, his eyes narrowing. He had learned long ago that patience was often stronger than action. He did not rush, he did not make a sound. From his vantage point, he could see the hunters' positions clearly, could anticipate their moves, and could trace the woman's path with absolute precision. Every detail mattered, the wind, the shifting light, the uneven rocks beneath her feet. He had watched others fail in the desert for overconfidence or haste. He would not let that happen here. The woman paused at a narrow bend in the canyon, leaning against the rock to catch her breath. She let her eyes sweep over the surrounding area, noting shadows and shapes that might conceal danger. She could feel the heat radiating off the stone, feel her skin blistering beneath it, yet she continued. Every instinct in her screamed to keep moving, to stay ahead of the hunters, and she obeyed without question. The desert had taught her lessons she could never forget, vigilance, patience, and endurance. Below her, the hunters adjusted their positions. One of them noticed the scuffed sand near a boulder and frowned. He leaned closer to inspect it, muttering to himself, and the others followed suit. For the first time they sensed something out of place. They did not see the Apache, of course, but their confidence wavered slightly. The desert had shifted against them, if only in small, almost imperceptible ways. And yet they pressed on, thinking that persistence alone would carry the day. The woman's mind drifted briefly to her past, memories of a life that had been far easier than this desert survival. She remembered a small home in the hills, a garden where she had once played as a child, the quiet voice of someone she had trusted who had ultimately turned away from her. Those memories fueled her now, giving her strength when every muscle in her body wanted to collapse. She drew the bundle closer, feeling the warmth, and whispered a silent promise that she would not be abandoned again. Above, the Apache tracked her movements with unerring precision. He had witnessed enough cruelty in the world to recognize desperation when he saw it. But he also saw something remarkable in the woman, a strength tempered by hardship, a stubbornness that refused to be crushed by circumstance. He considered the hunters carefully, noting their spacing, their rhythm, and their likely next steps. If he moved too soon, she could be caught. If he waited too long, the desert might claim her. Timing would be everything. The canyon twisted again, narrowing sharply, forcing the woman to press close against the rock. Her legs ached, her lungs burned, yet she pressed forward, careful not to make a sound. She could hear the hunters' voices now, a low murmur that reached her ears across the rocky walls. Their confidence was unnerving, yet she could not let it deter her. Every shadow, every shift in the sun, could signal danger, and she had learned to read them all. One of the hunters, a tall man with a sun-beaten hat, paused and squinted at a distant shadow near a ledge. "Did you see that?" he whispered, raising his rifle. The others leaned closer, trying to catch a glimpse. But the shadow moved imperceptibly, blending with the rocks, and disappeared almost immediately. The hunters exchanged uneasy looks, their confidence faltering for the first time. They had sensed something, though they did not understand what. The woman pressed herself closer to the canyon wall, feeling the heat radiate through the stone. Her mind raced, calculating each step, each possible route, each moment of pause. She had survived this long by relying on instinct, by reading the land as if it were a living thing. The bundle in her arms reminded her that she was not running aimlessly. It was a tether to purpose, a reason to endure, a reason to outlast. Above her, the Apache shifted, moving silently to a better vantage point. He traced the hunters' approach and noted the way their eyes flicked across the canyon. He could see their overconfidence, the way they relied on the assumption that the woman was alone and vulnerable. That assumption, he knew, would soon be challenged. He did not yet intervene, but he was preparing, aligning himself with the terrain, anticipating the moment when action would be necessary. The woman reached a slight opening in the canyon, a small pocket of shade where she could rest for a moment without being fully exposed. She crouched low, her hands pressed against the bundle, her eyes scanning the path ahead. She knew the hunters were close, could sense the tension in the air. She had survived this long because she understood danger, because she had learned to move in silence, to wait for the right moment to act. Below, the hunters began to split into two groups, trying to cover more ground. The tall man signaled, gesturing toward the rocks above, and they began moving cautiously. Their boots kicked up clouds of dust that rose and fell in the sun, the noise betraying their approach. They had begun to sense her resilience, her ability to disappear into the terrain, and it unnerved them. Their confidence wavered, but they pressed on. They had been trained to capture, to hunt, to assume control, and they were not willing to give up so easily. The woman's pulse quickened. She knew the canyon could provide temporary refuge, but she also knew it could trap her. The rocks rose sharply, leaving few options for escape. Every movement was measured, deliberate, and necessary. She considered climbing the ledge above her, but the sun had heated the rocks until they burned her fingers. She pressed the bundle closer and decided to continue along the narrow path, hoping to reach a more forgiving stretch of the canyon ahead. The Apache adjusted his stance, careful not to reveal himself. He had been tracking her since she entered the canyon, noting every subtle movement. every hesitation, every sign of fatigue. He understood the hunter's psychology as well. They would press forward aggressively if they believed she was cornered. Making mistakes that could be exploited? He traced each hunter's position, calculating how to use the rocks, the shadows, and the terrain to his advantage. Timing was everything, and he waited, silent, patient, ready. As the woman moved forward, she noticed subtle changes in the shadows on the canyon floor. Something was different, though she could not yet define it. Her instincts screamed that she was not entirely alone. She moved cautiously, adjusting her pace, listening to the faint sounds of shifting boots, the quiet rustle of sand, and the whisper of wind through the canyon. Every sense was heightened, every instinct alive, guiding her through the treacherous terrain. The hunters, now splitting their positions, moved with careful coordination. One of them whispered about the scuff marks in the sand, noting the faint trail of her passage. They had realized she was not merely lost or weak, but clever and determined. Their approach changed, more cautious now, though still confident in their numbers and skill. They did not notice the silent observer above, the figure blending perfectly with the stone, whose presence would soon disrupt their plans entirely. The woman's mind returned to the bundle. Whatever it contained, she knew it could not be left behind. It was more than an object. It was a symbol, a reason to endure, a reason to survive. She pressed on, navigating the narrow path, keeping one eye on the canyon floor and another scanning the ledges above. She felt the heat, the fatigue, the weight pressing down, but she also felt something else, a subtle shift in the air, a presence that hinted she was not truly alone. The Apache adjusted again, shifting slightly to follow the woman's movement without exposing himself. He calculated distances, noting where the hunters might be distracted, where they could be vulnerable, and where the woman could gain advantage. Every element of the canyon mattered. Every shadow, every rock, every inch of space that could conceal or protect. He remained still, waiting for the perfect moment, watching, silent and unrelenting. The woman moved forward cautiously, feeling the canyon walls press in around her. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps, her legs trembling with exhaustion, yet she continued. The bundle pressed against her chest reminded her of purpose, of survival, of resilience. She knew the hunters would not relent, but she also sensed, without fully understanding why, that help was closer than she realized. Below, the hunters continued their cautious advance, speaking in low, tense tones. One of them paused, squinting at a shadow on the canyon wall. "I swear I saw something," he muttered, his voice tight with unease. The others followed his gaze, uncertainty creeping into their movements. The desert, once indifferent, seemed to tighten its grip, and the hunter's confidence faltered. Above, the Apache remained perfectly still, every muscle coiled like a spring. He had witnessed the woman's determination, the hunter's miscalculations, and the subtle shifts in the canyon. The moment of action approached, but it had not yet arrived. Patience was essential. Every element had to align before he intervened, and he would not act until the precise moment demanded it. The woman, unaware of the figure above, pressed on. The canyon narrowed again, leaving barely enough room to move. She could hear the hunters' voices below, faint but steady, a constant reminder that they were near. Her pulse quickened, her breath ragged, yet she continued, guided by instinct, by memory, and by a small, unexplainable hope that she might survive the desert and the hunters alike. The tension in the canyon was thick and heavy, as if the rocks themselves were holding their breath. Every movement was critical, every sound a possible warning or threat. The woman, the hunters, and the silent observer above were caught in a delicate balance, each unaware of how close the threads of fate had drawn them together. The desert, vast and merciless, had become a stage for a struggle that would test every ounce of endurance, skill, and courage. The sun was now a brutal, unyielding force overhead, its heat pressing down on the canyon like a living weight. The woman moved along the narrow ledge, each careful step bringing her closer to a section of the canyon that offered slightly more room and a potential escape route. Her hands were raw from gripping the bundle, her dress plastered to her skin, and sweat stung her eyes. Yet she pressed on. Every step was driven by a quiet determination, the kind that had carried her through years of hardship, through loneliness and rejection, and now through the unforgiving desert. Below, the hunters crept along the canyon floor, their rifles ready, their movements deliberate. One of them noticed a scuff in the sand that had not been there a moment before. He paused, squinting, and nudged the man beside him. "She's trying to shake us," he muttered, frustration lacing his voice. The other hunter shook his head, muttering about luck and stubbornness. But both of them failed to see the shadow above, the figure crouched among the rocks, invisible and unblinking. The Apache shifted his position slightly, careful not to disturb a single pebble. He had been observing the woman for hours, studying her patterns, anticipating her moves. He understood the hunter's psychology as well. They were confident in numbers and force, but they were predictable, especially when they believed they had the advantage. The woman's strength, however, was a variable they could not foresee. That strength had carried her this far, and it would carry her further if guided at the right moment. The woman ducked under a rock overhang, pressing herself low. Her pulse pounded in her ears. She could hear the hunters' voices, a low murmur below, and the scrape of boots against stone. The air was thick, charged with tension, every sound amplified by the canyon walls. She knew she could not remain there long. The hunters would eventually reach the narrow bend and discover her hiding place. She needed to move, and yet moving was dangerous. Every instinct screamed for caution, every muscle burned with fatigue. The Apache shifted again, aligning himself with a narrow crevice that would give him a clear view of the hunter's approach. He noted the tall man with the sun-beaten hat, the one who had first noticed the scuff marks. That hunter was nervous now, glancing at the canyon walls more than ahead, and his companion mirrored the unease. The Apache understood that the moment of action was approaching, but he waited, knowing that one false move could spell disaster. Timing, patience, and precision, these were his allies. The woman moved slowly along the ledge, each step measured. Her mind drifted to the memories she carried, memories of a life once familiar, of rejection and abandonment. She had survived because she learned to rely on herself, because she refused to yield to circumstance. Now, in the canyon, she drew on that inner reservoir, knowing that each step could be the difference between survival and capture. The bundle pressed against her chest was her lifeline, her reminder of purpose. She could not falter. Below, the hunters had begun to spread out, trying to cover more ground. Their confidence had waned, replaced by a cautious persistence. The tall man gestured, and they advanced carefully, rifles sweeping the rocks for any sign of the woman. Their steps kicked up small clouds of dust that rose and fell in the hot air. The canyon seemed to tighten around them, its walls pressing in like the weight of inevitability. They did not notice the subtle shifts in shadows, the small traces of movement above them. The woman reached a narrow passage where the canyon walls formed jagged spikes on either side. She pressed herself against the stone, aware that one misstep could send her tumbling. Her fingers were raw from clutching the bundle, her legs trembled, and her breath came in shallow gasps. Yet she pressed forward, guided by instinct and an unshakable will to survive. Somewhere deep within, she felt a presence, though she could not see it, a sense that she was not entirely alone. Above her, the Apache adjusted his stance. He could see her hesitation, her fatigue, the subtle tremor in her steps. He also noted the hunter's approach, their overconfidence masking the tension now creeping into their movements. Every muscle in his body tensed in anticipation. He had witnessed her courage, her resilience, and he knew that intervention was near, but it had to be perfect. A misstep, a sound, a shadow cast wrong, and the fragile thread connecting her to survival could snap. The woman pressed on, moving carefully along the ledge, reaching a slight widening of the canyon floor. She crouched low, scanning for cover, and thought about her options. The path ahead narrowed again, and she could see that the canyon walls above her would soon leave her vulnerable. She sensed the hunters closing in, the scrape of boots growing louder. Her pulse quickened. Every instinct urged her to move faster, but every fiber of her body screamed exhaustion. The hunters paused at the base of the canyon, scanning upward. One of them whispered, "She can't hold out forever." His voice carried confidence, but it was thin, fraying at the edges. The other hunter nodded, though uncertainty flickered across his face. They were trained, skilled, and dangerous, but they had underestimated the woman's resilience. and they had no idea that an unseen observer had been tracking their every move. The Apache shifted slightly again, preparing to move. He considered the terrain, the angles, the shadows, and the gaps in the hunter's formation. He could act now, but the timing was crucial. The woman's path intersected with theirs below, and any sudden movement could alert them. He traced the ledge, the narrow passages, and the potential escape routes. Patience had carried him this far, but now action was imminent. The woman moved along the ledge, her legs trembling, her lungs burning, yet she pressed forward. She felt the weight of the bundle, the heat of the sun, and the constant presence of danger beneath her. Every step was a calculated risk. The canyon seemed to pulse around her, alive with tension. She could hear the faint murmur of voices, the subtle movement of boots on stone, and a deep, primal awareness told her she was being watched from above. The hunters advanced slowly, their rifles sweeping the canyon walls. They were cautious now, aware that their confidence had been shaken. The tall man paused again, pointing toward a shadow high above, though it moved with the wind and disappeared almost immediately. He muttered about tricks of the light, but unease lingered in his voice. The desert, so familiar and predictable before, now seemed almost alive, shifting subtly in ways they could not fully comprehend. The woman reached a particularly narrow stretch of ledge. The wall pressed close, the rocks above her jagged and unforgiving. Her legs shook with fatigue, her hands blistered and raw, yet she pressed forward, driven by determination, by instinct, by the knowledge that she could not surrender. She glanced down and saw the hunters moving closer, their shadows long across the sand, their rifles trained upward, scanning. Fear pressed against her chest, but she did not falter. Above her, the Apache prepared to move. He had tracked her struggle, anticipated the hunter's approach, and positioned himself for intervention. His breath was steady, his eyes unblinking, and every movement was deliberate. He had witnessed enough to understand the exact moment to act, the precise timing that would shift the balance. The canyon had become a battlefield of patience, wit, and endurance, and the moment of tension was at its peak. The woman pressed forward along the ledge, the bundle held close, each step measured. Her mind was sharp despite exhaustion, calculating angles, movements, and potential outcomes. She felt the hunters below, their proximity, their focus, and she knew that escape would require more than courage, it would require luck, cunning, and perhaps something she could not yet define. The hunters spread out at the canyon floor, their movements deliberate and cautious. They could feel the desert's shift, the tension in the air, and a subtle unease that made their steps more tentative. One whispered about the scuff marks again, another muttered that they were close to losing her. They did not see the silent figure above, the one who had watched her struggle for hours, the one who had planned every move with precision. The woman reached a section of the canyon where the ledge dipped sharply, forcing her to crouch low. The rocks pressed close, her hands scraped the rough stone, and she felt the heat radiate through her clothes. Her breath was ragged and her body screamed for rest, yet she pressed forward. Every instinct told her that survival was still possible, that the desert might not yet claim her, that the unseen watcher above could tip the balance. The Apache shifted again, lowering his stance, adjusting for the optimal moment. He could see the hunters' formation, the gaps in their approach, and the precise path the woman was taking. He understood that the moment of tension was approaching its peak. Every second counted, every movement mattered, and the outcome of this encounter teetered on a knife's edge. The woman pressed on, her pulse pounding, every muscle trembling. The hunters below moved closer, their voices faint but growing in intensity. The canyon seemed to hold its breath, the rocks and sand vibrating with the anticipation of what was about to unfold. She could sense the presence above, a silent watcher, though she did not yet know who it was. Hope flickered faintly, fragile but undeniable, mingling with the fear that still pressed against her chest. The canyon narrowed further, forcing the woman into a precarious path. Below, the hunters paused, signaling each other, their rifles scanning, their confidence wavering. Above, the Apache adjusted one final time, readying himself for action, prepared to intervene at the exact moment to protect the woman and shift the balance. The air was thick with heat and tension. The woman pressed forward, the hunters below unaware of the eyes watching from above. Every instinct screamed that something decisive was imminent, that the moment of confrontation was approaching. The desert had tested endurance, courage, and cunning, and now, at the peak of suspense, the next heartbeat would decide the course of what was to come. The woman moved with careful determination, the bundle pressed tightly to her chest. She glanced at the jagged rocks ahead, calculating the final stretch of the ledge. The hunter's shadows crept closer, their movements precise but cautious. She could feel the intensity of the moment, the culmination of hours of struggle, pursuit, and sheer survival instinct. Above, the Apache remained perfectly still, muscles coiled like springs, eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. He had traced her every step, anticipated the hunter's actions, and prepared for the precise moment when intervention could save her life. The tension had reached its absolute peak. The canyon seemed alive, charged with the imminent clash, every grain of sand, every rock, every shadow participating in the suspense that hung thick in the air. And in that moment, as the sun beat down and the hunters closed in, the woman, the hunters, and the silent observer above were all poised on the edge of fate. Every heartbeat, every breath, every movement counted. The desert had tested her resilience, her courage, and her will to survive. Now, at the peak of suspense, everything hung in fragile balance, waiting for the next move to tip the scales. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across the canyon and turning the sand into molten gold. The heat was still relentless, but the day had shifted, and with it so had the balance of the chase. The woman pressed against the ledge, the bundle held tightly to her chest. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, yet she could not stop. She had survived this far by trusting her instincts, by reading the desert as if it were a living map, and by holding on to the small, vital piece of hope that had driven her from the start. Above, the Apache moved silently along a narrow ledge, his presence unseen by the hunters below. He had spent hours studying the terrain, watching the woman's movements, and anticipating the hunter's every step. Now, with the canyon narrowing and the hunters closing in, the moment for action had arrived. He paused, drawing in a quiet breath, letting the weight of the desert, the heat, and the tense anticipation sharpen his senses. Timing was everything, and he knew it. The hunters below were tense now, their confidence shaken. They whispered among themselves, rifles ready, scanning every shadow. The tall man with the sun-beaten hat muttered under his breath, frustration lacing his words. "Where is she hiding?" "She can't be far." But in that moment they missed the subtle signs of the woman's cunning, the quiet strength that had kept her alive despite exhaustion and heat. They did not notice the shadow shifting above them, the arrow nocked silently, the calculated precision waiting to strike. The woman crept along the ledge, her eyes flicking to the canyon floor. She could see the hunters' movements, the way they spread out to cover more ground, and she understood that the moment for courage and speed had come. She took a deep breath, steadying herself despite the blistering sun and the fatigue threatening to overtake her. Her instincts guided her forward toward the narrowest point of the canyon that offered both danger and opportunity. Every careful step was a negotiation with fate itself. Suddenly, the Apache's arrow sang through the air, striking a rock near one of the hunters with a sharp, deliberate clang. The sound echoed through the canyon, startling the men. They ducked instinctively, searching for the source, their confidence giving way to tension. In that instant, the woman saw movement above her, just enough to understand that she was not alone. A figure, dark and steady, moved with purpose, signaling that help had come when she needed it most. She did not pause, did not look back. She pressed forward, using the momentary distraction to move toward a safer stretch of the canyon. Her legs burned, her lungs ached, yet the knowledge that she was no longer entirely alone infused her with renewed energy. The hunters recovered quickly, shouting warnings to one another, but the terrain and the sudden appearance of an unseen ally had shifted the advantage. The desert, so harsh and unyielding moments before, now seemed to bend slightly in her favor. The Apache continued his silent, precise intervention, using the rocks to block and redirect the hunters' movements. One of the men stumbled on a loose stone, another found himself momentarily disoriented by the arrow striking near him. The woman moved along the canyon, weaving through narrow passages, guided by the instinct that had kept her alive for hours. Each step brought her closer to the canyon's edge, closer to the possibility of escape, closer to safety. The bundle in her arms was heavy, but she could not abandon it. It was a symbol of her perseverance, a piece of her purpose, and she pressed it closer, drawing strength from it. She remembered the past, the family who had abandoned her, the cruel world that had tested her resolve from the start. Yet in that moment, as she pressed forward with every ounce of strength left in her body, she realized that survival was more than physical. It was the will to endure, to fight, and to embrace hope even when all seemed lost. Below, the hunters regrouped, frustration mounting. They could sense that they were losing control, that the desert was no longer cooperating with their pursuit. They shouted to one another, frustrated and panicked, their rifles swinging between shadows. Yet they could not anticipate the precision of the Apache's movements, nor the woman's resourcefulness. Every step she took was calculated, every movement guided by experience and instinct, every breath a defiance of the desert and the hunters alike. The canyon widened slightly, revealing a ledge that overlooked a small clearing where shade and cooler air awaited. The woman made her way carefully, the bundle still pressed to her chest. Her body was on the brink of collapse, yet the sight of potential refuge propelled her forward. She did not know if she could reach it before the hunters regained focus, but she moved with the courage and resolve that had carried her this far. The Apache descended slightly, careful not to expose himself, using the rocks and shadows to remain hidden while continuing to distract the hunters. He had positioned himself strategically, forcing the men to focus on threats they could not fully see while giving the woman a path toward safety. His presence was unseen but vital, the quiet guidance and protection that would shift the tide of this desperate encounter. The hunters shouted again, realizing that the woman was still moving, still evading capture. One of them raised his rifle to fire, only to find an arrow lodged in the sand near his foot. Panic surged, tension thickening the air. They were skilled and experienced, yet they had underestimated the woman, and they had not accounted for the silent protector who had watched and waited, ready to intervene at precisely the right moment. The woman reached the small clearing, a temporary haven of shade and relative calm. She crouched low, catching her breath, her body trembling, yet she felt a sense of triumph even in exhaustion. The desert had tested her, the hunters had hunted her, yet she had survived, driven by courage, instinct, and the unseen presence that had guided her. She glanced upward, catching a fleeting shadow of the Apache moving across the rocks above. Recognition flickered in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the help she had received without fully understanding it. The hunters were momentarily disoriented, their confidence shaken by the unexpected resistance. They shouted to one another, frustrated by the invisible force that had disrupted their pursuit. Their plan had failed, their assumptions proven wrong, and the desert now seemed to turn against them. The woman, though exhausted, recognized the shift. The hunters were vulnerable, distracted, and she had gained a measure of control over her own fate for the first time since the pursuit had begun. Above, the Apache remained vigilant, ensuring the hunters could not regain dominance. He moved with careful precision, calculating every movement to maximize the woman's chance of escape. His presence was steady and calm, a contrast to the chaos below. He understood the stakes, understood the danger, and knew that the woman's survival depended on the quiet, deliberate intervention he provided. The woman adjusted the bundle in her arms, pressing it closer, feeling its warmth, its weight, its significance. She had carried it through the desert, through the hunter's pursuit, through heat and exhaustion, and it had become more than an object. It was a lifeline, a symbol of resilience and purpose. She allowed herself a brief moment of reflection, recognizing the strength within her that had carried her this far. The canyon seemed to hold its breath as the hunters tried to regroup. Their movements were cautious now, their frustration evident, their confidence eroded by the unexpected intervention above. The desert, which had seemed merciless moments before, now offered the woman a narrow window of opportunity. She pressed forward carefully, moving along the ledge toward a path that led out of the canyon, toward freedom. The Apache followed silently, ensuring that the hunters could not intercept her path. He had watched her struggle, recognized her courage, and now guided her toward safety without drawing attention to himself. The precision of his actions, the careful timing, and the understanding of the hunter's psychology created a delicate balance that favored survival. The woman reached a narrow path that led upward, out of the canyon, toward the edge of the desert plain. Her body was trembling, her lungs burning, yet she pressed on, driven by the instinct for survival and the quiet knowledge that she was no longer entirely alone. Every step was a victory, every movement a defiance of the hunters who had pursued her with cruelty and confidence. The hunters realized too late that the advantage had shifted irreversibly. Their shouts grew frantic, their movements disorganized, as the unseen force above and the woman's determination worked in tandem. One of them stumbled, another turned too quickly, and the desert claimed the moment. Their confidence had been shattered, their plans undone, and the pursuit that had seemed certain to succeed now teetered on the brink of failure. The woman emerged from the canyon onto the open plain, the heat still pressing, but the path ahead now visible and clear. She crouched for a moment, catching her breath, feeling the sand beneath her feet, the warmth of the desert around her. She allowed herself a quiet sense of triumph. She had survived, endured, and persevered, guided by instinct, courage, and the unseen hand that had protected her when all seemed lost. Above, the Apache watched the hunters retreat, their confidence broken, their frustration evident. He allowed himself a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement that the immediate danger had passed. The woman's resilience, combined with his intervention, had tipped the balance. The desert, so harsh and unrelenting, had been survived and life had prevailed. The woman pressed the bundle closer one last time, feeling its weight and warmth. She had carried more than an object through the desert. She had carried her will, her hope, and her determination. She allowed herself a small smile, knowing that she had endured what others might have thought impossible. The hunters had failed, the desert had tested her, and now, finally, she could move forward into the safety that had once seemed unreachable. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson. The woman stood on the edge of the plain, the canyon behind her, the open land ahead, and felt a sense of completion. She had survived the relentless heat, the hunter's pursuit, and the harshness of the desert. She had endured, prevailed, and now could take her first steps toward a life renewed, a life shaped not by fear but by courage and perseverance. The Apache remained on the rocks above, a silent guardian who had witnessed her struggle and intervened with precision and care. He watched her move forward, ensuring that she was safe from immediate danger, and then slowly disappeared into the shadows of the canyon, leaving her to continue her journey with the knowledge that she was not alone, that courage and resilience had seen her through. The desert fell into quiet, the heat softening, the shadows lengthening. The woman moved steadily across the sand, her steps lighter now, her burden eased though not forgotten. She had faced danger, endured hardship, and survived against the odds. The hunters were left behind, the canyon silent, and the desert itself seemed to acknowledge her triumph. She paused once more, looking back at the jagged rocks, the narrow ledges, the place that had tested every ounce of her courage and skill. The memory of the struggle remained, a reminder of resilience, determination, and the power of endurance. And with that memory she turned forward, pressing into the fading light, the bundle held close, and the knowledge that she had emerged stronger, wiser, and alive. The desert stretched ahead, vast and open, full of possibilities. The woman stepped into it, carrying her purpose, her courage, and the quiet hope that had guided her through every trial. Behind her, the canyon receded, the hunters defeated, and the world seemed to hold its breath in acknowledgement of her victory. She had survived the relentless heat, endured pursuit and danger, and now could begin a new chapter of life, one shaped not by fear or abandonment, but by strength, courage, and the unyielding will to endure. And as the sun dipped fully below the horizon, casting the desert in twilight, the woman moved forward, free at last from the shadow of pursuit, carrying with her the lesson that courage, resilience, and the quiet help of those who watch unseen can overcome even the harshest trials. The desert had tested her, but she had endured, and the story of survival, hope, and quiet triumph would remain etched in every grain of sand she left behind.